collagen, although they both have calcium that strengthens and hardens those structures. So although they share similar compositions, they are very different, which is why we don't call the teeth bones. So that was a really interesting question. Thank you for that. Hopefully we've got more this afternoon.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Why don't the North Hemisphere great white sharks and the South Hemisphere great white sharks cross the equator and mix?
So it's thought that the equator provides a very strong boundary where the conditions are just not favorable for them. So the genetic studies that have happened have simply not shown relatedness between those populations.
Yes.
And the theory is that it's the equator. But of course, maybe there's another reason that we don't fully understand it. But in other marine species, the equator does form this barrier, this invisible barrier as such, because the conditions are so different at the equator.
It would be interesting to know if electricity, like from the Earth poles or something like that, or the Earth's magnetic field has anything to do with it.
Well, that's a really good point, because sharks do use the magnetic field of the Earth for navigation, so it would be really interesting. I don't know a lot about that topic, but yeah, that would make sense on some level. It could very well be possible. Great, thank you. So yesterday we started off with the biodiversity of sharks, and today we're going to learn about the important role that sharks play in the ecosystem. And we've got two fabulous shark scientists here to talk to us today. I'm going to be introducing Meg, who will give the first 30 minutes, providing you with a general overview of the topic. And then Lee will be following that. I'll introduce her when we change the talks over. She'll be going into a little bit more detail with regards to a specific study that she did on seven-gill sharks in False Bay. So I'd like to introduce Meg, Megan McCord. I've known Meg now for many years, and she is one of those ladies that we became friends through our shared passion for sharks and getting involved in sharks. Megan is the director of the South African Shark Conservancy, which is based in Hermanus, which is a non-profit organization that researches various species of shark, particularly our endemic sharks, as well as the interactions between sharks and people. So some of the projects that she's involved in is getting the community, the local community involved in research. And as such has also started a company called the Shark Company, where they take members of the public or any interested people along on shark field work so that they can get hands-on experience with that in Hermanus. She's been working on sharks for 20 years now. She started off in Canada with blue sharks. She's worked on mako sharks. She's worked on various other species, particularly the endemics, and she's got a master's degree from Rhodes University in fisheries science. And she's also just very recently been appointed the South African representative, and I have to read this, it's a very long name. It's the Western Indian Ocean Marine Sciences Association, Women in Marine Science, and she's the South African representative of that. And she was just recently on a trip in Kenya to represent South Africa and women in science through that. So a very warm welcome to Meg today.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Fantastic. And can you hear me okay? It's not too loud. My husband would tell me I'm too loud. No, okay. So thank you so much, Alison, for the wonderful welcome and the incredible opportunity to be here today and speak with you guys about my favorite topic, of course, which is sharks. And Alison asked us to present on the role of sharks in the oceans, and that is one of the most common questions that you get asked. Okay, well, sharks are threatened or sharks are endangered, but actually, why should we care? And there's many complex reasons for that, and I hope I'm not going to be able to address them all in the time frame that we have today, but I will address some of the key concepts that I think are relevant to understanding the role that sharks play in ocean ecosystems and how that relates to us as human beings, because of course the connectedness between humans and sharks is actually inextricable. So it is phenomenal. And I don't actually know how to flip through the slides.
Keyboard gets in the way.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry. Shark scientist, not technologically inclined. So I'm sure all of you are aware of the fact that the oceans play a vital role in human functioning. And for many, many, many years, we've been documenting this from a cultural or economic or ecological perspective. And the oceans provide us with this fantastic place to visit. You know, I don't know if you guys feel the same as I do, but when I go to the ocean and I breathe in the salt air and I listen to the crashing waves, there's a sense of peace that overcomes me. And I suspect that's largely to do with our history in the womb of our mothers as we're developing. And for me, I think it's vital that as the human population continues to grow, that we acknowledge the really important role from a food provision perspective, from a cultural heritage perspective, that the oceans do in fact have on us. One of the more tangible things, of course, is understanding the link between the very air that we're breathing as human beings and the oxygen that is provided by ocean ecosystems. And I don't know if you're familiar with some of those statistics, but kelp forest ecosystems and coral reef ecosystems provide between 50 and 80% of the atmospheric oxygen on the Earth. So the very air we breathe today, everybody, has a lot to do with the health and integrity of the coastal ecosystems that we are very familiar with here in Cape Town. So perhaps you're wondering how sharks fit into that picture, and it's not an easy picture to figure out as a scientist. In the terrestrial environment, it's a very two-dimensional environment. You can go into Kruger National Park and study the role of lion or hyenas and physically quantify the impact that they're having on the other animals around them. However, if you go out onto the ocean on your boat, unless you're Superman, you can't see what's happening underneath those waves. So it's very, very difficult to quantify, which from a scientific perspective is super important. All of our information is evidence-based. We're fact-based. That's how we're trained, right? So we can't reliably look at something and be able to see how sharks are influencing and impacting other creatures and ecosystems around them. But I think for a very long time, we've, as marine scientists, have taken lessons from our terrestrial ecologist brethren, and we like to extend what they've learned in Kruger National Park and apply it to our understanding of ecosystems in ocean environments. So we could say that hyena play a very vital role in keeping terrestrial ecosystems intact, in the same way that mesopredators, or predators that sit in the middle of a food web, play, such as these leopard cat sharks, in functioning intact ocean ecosystems. So many people would think that sharks are apex predators, right? That means you're at the top of the food chain, and everything underneath that is subject to your mercy. That is just not the fact. As you learned yesterday from Alison, sharks are very diverse. They feed on many different things. They have very different functional roles, but they eat everything that you could actually even imagine. So I've studied blue sharks in the Northwest Atlantic, and I found lots of jellyfish in their stomachs. They preferred to eat jellyfish over anything else. These leopard cat sharks, have you seen leopard cat sharks before? So these are endemic to South Africa or Southern Africa, meaning they don't occur anywhere else in the world. They're really fantastic. But these guys are mesopredators, so they're in that middle line of the food web, right? The apex predator, the middle predator here, and then the bottom of the food web down here, so things that produce oxygen and make food for other animals. What we've seen through dietary analyses of these sharks is that they'll eat everything from whale skin, and I don't think they go out and eat whales physically. They only grow to about this big, so I think it would be a heck of a job for them to hunt down a southern right. But I think that, if whale skin falls off a whale after it breaches, the shark will see it and it will eat it, and it probably serves some sort of nutritional value. On the other hand, the most common things that we find in the stomachs of these particular sharks are mollusks and sea snails, things like that. So they're keeping all those populations underneath them in check, right? When you're controlling the population of snails, the snails like to eat kelp. So if you're removing these mesopredators from the environment, it's likely that the snail population will explode and eat all of the kelp and thereby impact the very oxygen we breathe. Of course, you do have the more conventional apex predators, and Lee will be talking about that in her presentation, so I don't want to address it too much. But again, that just means you're at the top of the food chain and you eat other large predators or mesopredatory animals as well. Have you guys ever heard of the term keystone species? Okay. Now, because it's really hard to figure out what sharks' role is in ocean ecosystems, I'm using an example of sea otters. And this is an example off the west coast of North America where sea otters were heavily harvested for their pelts and used for coats, beautiful otter coats. What we found, of course, is that when these animals were driven to the brink of extinction, the food source that they kept in control, the sea urchins, their populations exploded, and sea urchins eat a lot of kelp. And when the sea urchin population exploded, remember this mesopredatory effect, these kelp forests declined, and that had a huge impact on commercially valuable fish species, for example, which use kelp forest ecosystems as hideaways from other larger, more predatory animals. So these ecosystems are really, really, really vital, and keystone species are animals that, if removed from a functioning ecosystem, does have a trickle-down impact on the ecosystem beneath it. Does that make sense? Perfect. So with sharks, sorry, I should actually go back. I'm getting back ahead of myself. With sharks, we do think this is happening, and the reason we think this is happening is because of the unfettered, really, commercial exploitation or bycatch issues or climate change issues that we're faced with today. And I won't get into that because we've got other scientists who will be dealing with that topic tomorrow. But this removal of these predators or these keystone species from coastal marine ecosystems or other critical habitats in the ocean are undoubtedly having trickle-down impacts. But as I said, it's just very difficult to be able to quantify those. But we do know from studies in other ocean ecosystems where we can watch the animals and actually see what their impact is, that it's very likely removing these sharks from ocean ecosystems is going to have an impact. And of course, that means an impact on the fish that we eat and the very air that we breathe. The other interesting and slightly out there hypothesis about sharks is that there is this mesopredatory release effect. When you're removing apex predators from an ecosystem, that leaves the whole realm open. And if you're a predator in the middle of the food web, a mesopredator, you've got nothing else that can eat you. So your population explodes. And of course, remember the sea otter before that was verging on extinction and it ate all the kelp beds died off? In this case, what would happen is that your predators, your mesopredators, here black rats, their population explodes and they eat everything else underneath it. And then there's no food left for any of the other animals that are so vital for that functioning ecosystem. I suspect that we're seeing that in some areas here in South Africa, and I'll show you a video about it now. Again, the tangibleness of all of this is really, really difficult, but we know that it happens everywhere else in the world, in terrestrial environments. Why would it not happen in oceans as well? But I think what we've learned over the years of trying to find different ways of studying these things in the ocean is that these food web interactions are much more complex than we ever gave them credit for. And Lee has a brilliant diagram that addresses that very fact. But it's not just one shark that's exercising all the control over the populations underneath it. It's the shark, and it's the climate, and it's humans, and it's other fish, and it's mesopredators, and it's really hard to tease out, the different functions of all of those and all the different impacts. So the reason that I say we think that this mesopredator release effect may be happening is based on some research that we've been doing in Walker Bay, which is around Hermanus, for the last 6 or 7 years. Walker Bay was once home to one of the biggest shark fishing industries in the country, and still today lands a fair number of sharks for commercial purposes. We know that the commercially exploited historical species such as soupfin shark or falleye, as well as smoothhound shark populations, have experienced dramatic declines. And we think that there might be some control that those sharks were having over their environment. So we would classify falleye or soupfin sharks and smoothhound sharks as mesopredators because they eat shellfish and other small fish and things like that, but aren't super predatory like a great white. So what we've seen over the last few years is that although we're documenting quite a lot of sharks and a lot of diversity in Walker Bay, we're missing out on some of the big sharks that we would expect to see in that area, given the historical fisheries catches. I just wanted to show you a little video of what that looked like. So very diverse, but not a lot of apex predator sharks in our area. Or not. I promise you, there's the technical team. Double click. Yeah. It was working when we tested it earlier. Sorry, guys.
It was working.
Yeah.
Put it on.
I'm just gonna, sorry for the
If you click just the
pause.
space.
Was it? Thanks. So what you'll see here are some dogfish sharks and some puff-adder shy sharks. We get about 5 or 6 different species, guitarfish in here, but none of these animals would be classified as an apex predator by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, they're probably some of the favorite food of things like cow sharks or great whites at some stages in their life history. So we've now collected close to 1,400 hours of this type of footage from underneath the waves of Walker Bay, from Betty's Bay Marine Protected Area to Danger Point. And we've detected things like seven-gill cow sharks. We've never seen a great white shark, despite the fact that we're right next door to one of the largest aggregations of white sharks in the world, historically. Not anymore. And we know that there were big bronze whaler sharks, apex predators of the ocean that did exist in this area once upon a time when it was a very important fisheries hub. Now what we're seeing are all of these small little guys, and they're very cute, right? They're fantastic to see. They're great for educating the public about misconceptions about sharks, but they are not serving any sort of top-down control over the food webs. So what we've also noticed over the last few years is that the habitats, the quality of the habitats that we've been surveying in the area, so we went from really diverse kelp forest ecosystems to systems that aren't as diverse anymore. And we're not seeing the same abundance of other fish species or the same diversity of other fish species. Whether that's related to this or not, we're not 100% sure because, of course, at the same time, we have a lot of abalone poaching and rock lobster poaching that are happening in that area. So it could be related to that too. But it's my hope that one day we'll see lots of big predatory sharks on here because predatory sharks, as far as we're concerned as scientists, are very good indicators of ecosystem health. Okay. And to really illustrate it nicely, how this whole thing works together, I've taken this extract from a paper that was published in 2016. If you're interested in reading it, it's actually a really nice paper and the source is there. What typically happens, in addition to the role in food webs that these animals play, they also influence the behavior of the other species around them, right? So if you're a big predatory apex predator shark, like this hammerhead shark here, that is quite transient. It moves around ocean basins. It spends a lot of time far out to sea. But when it comes into a coral reef ecosystem, all the other fish that sit below it on the food web are going to be scared, and they'll probably hide away. And what that function actually does is create a lot of opportunity for fish to diversify and habitats to diversify in these ecosystems. So they exercise not only this trophic control or this food web control over the animals underneath them, but they also help to behaviorally modify how other species behave. And that, we do know, actually creates increased diversity. So you never would have thought, actually, really about that, or I certainly hadn't given it a lot of thought before. Additionally, of course, we have these animals that are the mesopredators, certainly, and actually the apex predators as well, spend a lot of time removing the sick and the injured and the non-genetically fit or the genetically unfit animals from these ecosystems. And that has huge benefits for things like evolution and the stability of populations. So I always equate it, because people really have a hard time picturing what this means in the ocean, I always equate it to the hyena scenario in a terrestrial environment. So I would never say that sharks are necessarily like lion, but I would say they're more like the hyena, and they'll go in and they'll pick at what they can, and they'll opportunistically eat a lot of things, but they do have a high degree of control over everything that happens underneath them. One of the things that I believe that we should be considering when we're talking about the role of sharks, it's not just about their ecological role, because sometimes that's quite an intangible thing for people to get their heads around. We were having a conversation at lunch about this, whether we start assigning monetary values to ocean spaces and species, because that resonates with humans and certainly with politicians. So if we're wanting to change perceptions and wanting people to implement meaningful conservation and management measures, maybe we need to start thinking about these as economies in their own rights instead of about important from an ecological perspective. And that's an argument for over many beers, I think. But to contextualize this, there's this wonderful little infographic that I found, and of course, this is from South Africa and the white shark cage diving capital of the world, once upon a time. The caveat keeps coming out, sorry. And this is a little bit old. So this was published in 2016. I'm not sure of the newer financial numbers, but $4.4 million per annum was what the cage diving industry was valued at. It was 2004. Was that okay, so that was based on a study from 2004. Sorry, the infographic itself was published in 2016. So, that's 15 years ago, and we know that shark-based ecotourism has expanded unfettered, really, in this country. So, if you look at the value of living sharks from an ecotourism perspective and from an economic perspective, then perhaps we can gain a better understanding of what their role is actually for people, because these industries support hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals in the communities in which they occur, such as Gansbaai or Claimbaai. That being said as well, if we think about sharks as food, and Charlene would love this because she's a sharks as food kind of person. Sharks are food. We eat them. So on that note, that also sustains a number of fishing communities whose livelihoods depend on the role of sharks in the oceans and the health of sharks in the oceans. So maybe we just need to start changing our mindsets a little bit, thinking about the economies of sharks instead of purely just the ecological role. Yes. Yes. It's purely numbers of people, I would think, and Yeah, very good point. And that is one of the faults of this infographic. But I just thought it would be nice to illustrate actually how valuable they can be for local economies. Having said that, of course, I'm a scientist and I'm a conservationist first and foremost and not an economist. So I really firmly believe that the ecological role of these animals and understanding the control they exercise over their environments and therefore the services, the ecosystem goods and services that they provide to us through intact ecosystems that mean we have access to commercial fish species that we like to eat, or rock lobster that we might like to have on our dinner plate, or even just being present and being human. We should acknowledge that we do have a responsibility to care for these animals that have been around for 440 million years. And the fact that they do have important cultural heritage in a lot of communities as well. So there's many, many, many communities around the world, even around coastal Africa, that have this historical connectedness with these animals because, when they were out at sea and they were fishing, they regarded these sharks as being gods for their communities, and that they had these really important functional roles in ensuring that the sailors and the fishermen and everything were safe while they were at sea too. So it's not purely just about the ecological role from my perspective, but it's understanding that combined with people's connectedness to these animals and the very specific scientific meaning that they do have. Alison yesterday mentioned that sharks have been around for 440 million odd years, right? You guys remember that? And they've survived 5 global mass extinction events. Now, I'm not going to get into detail in this because tomorrow's presentations will be on threats to sharks and things that are happening to sharks because of our actions. But we're very aware of the fact that we're probably entering a 6th mass extinction event, and sharks may be one of those groups of animals that do go extinct. And if you go back to my first slides that said that the oceans, for us as human beings, make us connected. They serve a huge amount of purposes in our lives, from 70% of the protein that many people eat are ocean-derived, rely on sharks to keep those ecosystems intact and keep them healthy. 50 to 80% of the very oxygen we're breathing is related to healthy ocean ecosystems. I don't think that we can really say, even if we don't understand how sharks truly function in their ecosystems, I don't think it is fair for us to say that they don't matter or that they don't count. Or maybe it's not up to us to understand the role and be able to decipher it in its entirety. Some mysteries are best left mysteries, right? So if we can rather understand the connectedness between an apex predator and a mesopredator and the animals underneath it and the kelp forests and the coral reefs and the oxygen and the culture and the peace that we derive when we go to the sea, I think we have a better opportunity to try and stem the tide and help demystify sharks and help other people understand really what their true value and meaning is. And that's it. Thank you.
So I'm just going to introduce me and just help you with Okay, so if you can save your questions till after Lee's presentation. Lee Denecker is one of my master students. Well, she was. She has since moved on to work at the Tertians Aquarium. So Lee completed her master's at the University of Cape Town 2 years ago. And she's been working at the Tertians Aquarium now on looking after sharks and rays inside the exhibitions. and she's also a commercial diver, as well as a paddy dive instructor. So she's got a lot of experience working underwater, observing sharks in their natural environment, species at the Two Oceans Aquarium. And I must just mention, Lee got a distinction for her masters at the University of Cape Town.
Testing. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you for the lovely introduction, Alison. So I'm going to be talking to you today about my master's project, which I was lucky enough to do on this beautiful smiley dinosaur. So this is the broad-nosed seven-gill shark, and I looked into their diet. And this was focused in False Bay. So I'm sure all of you have been to the False Bay area. Most of you know it as home of the white shark, but I'm sure a few of you knew that there's actually another apex predatory shark in the waters in False Bay. So this is it. Very proud of my study species, and we're telling you a little bit more about why I think why they're important in the False Bay ecosystem. So as Meg's already introduced and given you a bit of background on, apex predators are very, very important in preserving our ecosystem's health, the stability of these ecosystems, as well as the diversity, which is something Meg touched on too. So as researchers, for us looking at the feeding ecology of these sharks, it's very important to understand the different interactions between predators and prey, because they do have regulatory effects on the marine ecosystems. And as scientists, one of the ways I'll give you a bit of a brief as to how we find this out. As Meg mentioned, it's not like going into the Kruger National Park where you can just watch a lion catch an antelope. Here, it's a little bit more challenging. So for us, one of the ways we find out what a shark is eating is by looking inside their stomachs. So a challenge in getting whatever is inside a shark's stomach out of the stomach. Often it involves lethal methods, which we try to avoid. So there is a complementary or alternative method, which is called a stable isotope analysis. So I'm going to go into it very, very briefly, just so you understand some of the graphs that I'm going to show you. But it's based on the premise that you are what you eat. So the stable isotope values of the predator reflect those of their prey. So we get little samples of tissue. In this case, I used blood, plasma, and muscle. We just get samples from the sharks, and then we can release them. And then what we do with that is we run it through the whole stable isotope analysis, which I'm not going to go into detail with, but we look at carbon in the tissues, and that gives us so much information from just a piece of muscle from the shark, the size, not even the size of a fingernail. From that carbon value, we can get an idea of the habitat that a shark is foraging in. And from the nitrogen value, from that little piece of tissue, we can actually see its relative position in the food web. So quite a lot of information we can get from these tissue samples. So a little bit of background around the seven-gill shark. It is quite widely distributed worldwide in our shallow coastal waters, temperate waters. So in studies done on seven-gill sharks in California, Argentina, as well as Tasmania, and some studies done in South Africa, we found them to have a really diverse diet. So they're considered generalist predators, meaning that they feed on a lot of different things. And it has also been found in previous studies that they are, in fact, apex predators, as I mentioned, but a study that looked at the trophic levels, or at least the position of sharks in the food chain relative to each other, found seven-gill sharks to hold the highest position in 149 species done in this study, so even higher than a great white, which is very, very interesting. So to me, I couldn't get my mind, that just didn't seem right. So I did that using the stable isotope analysis, and be very interested to see some of the results. As with a lot of shark species, sadly, by the IUCN, they have listed the seven-gill shark as data deficient, meaning that we simply just don't know enough about the species to be able to classify them. We don't know, are they endangered, or are they not of concern? So that's why this kind of research is important for conservation of the species. So as I mentioned, the samples that I got from these cow sharks were in False Bay, predominantly the Castle Rock Marine Protected Area, which I've highlighted by that block there. But the sharks do seem to move around the bay. Some of our preliminary tracking data, which a friend of mine, Tammy, has been looking at, has found some of them, well, pretty much using the bay quite well, but I don't want to go too much into that. But also Seal Island seems to be a new hangout spot for them, which is quite interesting. And we'll see just why. So this Miller's Point was an aggregation site at one point. There's been some interesting things happening there, but you could go down on a dive and that's a pretty picture of what you'd see, all these cow sharks or seven-gill sharks hanging around. So I just really like that picture, had to put it in. Okay, so if we want to understand the feeding dynamics between predators and their prey, we need to get these samples. So firstly, the predators. So I've already told you we have the cow shark, but then we do have another, which, yeah, we can't ignore the white shark. It also a very, very important predator in False Bay. So it was very interesting to compare how two apex predators sharing the same bay, how are they coexisting? How are they using the same resources? Are they using them differently? So let's get into the results. Oh, well, firstly, let's show you the diversity in what they do eat. So I think Alison told you a little bit about chimeras yesterday. This is a St. Joseph shark. So chondrichthyan species, that includes your sharks, your rays, and your chimeras. So they group, so if I mention the word chondrichthyans, just so you're aware of what I'm talking about, but it's basically a group of, which includes the chimeras, the sharks, and the rays. So this is an important food group for the shark, if not the most important. Then Cape fur seal, interestingly enough, we all know the great white eats it, but seven-gill sharks, also a very important prey source. Various fish species, bony fish species, some of your mesopredatory sharks that Meg spoke about, your pajama sharks, other cat sharks and shy sharks too. And then we also have other shark species like your soup fin sharks, smoothhound sharks, which are some of the seven-gill's favorite, in fact. So my point is their diet is very, very diverse. So diverse that just for my study alone, I managed to get 32 different prey species, and the seven-gill's feeding on almost all of them. So that's just a list of some of the prey species that I did get. And just to make it a little bit easier to understand, I grouped them based on their habitats, where they occur, as well as their biology. Which will put this in context a little bit more. So I'm going to explain this quite nicely. As I mentioned earlier, the stable isotope analysis, that nitrogen value that you get, that tells you the position of the animal in the food chain, or in the food web at least. So going up there, so unfortunately I don't have a pointer to show you, but right at the top of that is the cow shark. Interestingly, just below it, you have the white shark. So from these stable isotope values, it is confirming that study that was done in 1999 that cow sharks, or seven-gill sharks, actually hold the highest trophic position of all sharks, which is very, very interesting. I'll tell you a little bit more about why later, but just to show you the bigger picture. And then that carbon value, that shows you the environment in which they're foraging. So cow sharks occur mostly in shallow inshore environments, and this stable isotope results just confirm that quite nicely. And whereas white sharks are a little bit more to the other side, they are known to feed in more offshore areas at certain times of year as well. So this graph positioned everything more or less where we'd expect it to be. And then if we bring in our prey species, I've used emojis just to take the whole concept of stable isotopes, which took me 6 years to understand, just to make it a little bit more user-friendly. So the little guy at the top next to the white shark, that's your seals. The seals are still very important predators. And then below them, we have some of the other chondrichthyan sharks and other fish species. And I'll put a little crayfish right at the bottom there. So that just gives you a kind of idea of the False Bay food web and what it looks like. So focusing a little bit more on the 7-gill diet, the little red dots represent individual 7-gill sharks. And the triangles sorry, I don't have a pointer, so this is a little bit challenging, but the closer one of those dots are to a particular prey group tells you what that individual shark is eating more of. So to put it more simply, 7-gills in general, most of their diet consists of those chondrichthyan species, so other species of shark, ray, and chimeras. Seals, however, form a much larger percentage of their diet than what we would expect. Because if you think about what a great white shark has to do to catch a seal, launching itself out the water, I'm sure we've all seen the majestic breach. How is a cow shark managing to eat more seal than what a great white would? So still a lot of room for research there. As with most research, you end up with more questions than answers at the end of a study, but keeps the jobs open for us, I guess. And just to make it a little bit easier to understand, looking at false bay food web as a whole, we've got our 2 apex predators. So even though white sharks, by stable isotope standards, aren't right at the top, they are still apex predators, apex predatory sharks in false bay. And the reason for the difference in the isotope values is just the amount of seal in their diet. So we do have to look at some of the tracking and movement data to get a better idea of how the cow sharks are using the bay, and there is a study being done on that at the moment. But with the white sharks, they, as Alison's research has shown, they feed on seals seasonally. So in the winter months in False Bay, they feed on seals, and in the summer months, they seem to move away and feed on more fish species. Whereas it's likely that the 7-gill sharks are feeding on seals more consistently and possibly throughout the year. So therefore, in those tissue samples that I'm getting, there's a higher percentage of seal just because of that consistent feeding on them. But we do have to look at this data with the movement data to be able to be sure of that. If we bring in our other prey groups, so our mesopredatory sharks and some of the fish species, we can see that, well, we know that the 7-gill sharks have a diverse diet and that they are feeding on all of those different groups. Our white sharks are also feeding from similar prey groups. The seals, they'll be eating some of the fish species. They'll also be eating some offshore species of fish. And some of the smaller shark species they'll prey on too. And some of the sharks will be eating the smaller fish, and then I'll put little crustaceans at the bottom, basically eaten by everything else. So as you can see, this is just a very, very basic idea of the False Bay food web. But you can see it's quite dynamic. There's a lot of different things going on there. And if we look at why these apex predatory sharks would be important, and this goes back to some of the things that Meg pointed out, say you had to have a decline in these apex predatory shark species. The mesopredators, it is likely that their numbers would increase. Now, this is just modeled on some of the terrestrial examples and the examples Meg used. So this isn't actually a study that's shown this, but this is just to show, based on these other studies, what the issue could be if we remove these top predatory sharks, or if their numbers decline. Some of the groups, we might not even know what their effect would be, because as much as there'd be less predation pressure from your apex predatory sharks, you'd still have predation pressure from Cape fur seals and other mesopredators. And then ultimately you could have a decline in what's a very, very important food source for a lot of your mesopredators. So this is just a False Bay example as to what the implications could be in the ecosystem if we had to lose these sharks in big numbers. So just to conclude, we know that large predatory sharks do feed on, well, the reason they're positioned at or near the top of food webs is because they feed on other large fish, marine mammals, as well as other shark, ray, and chimera species. And yeah, this could ultimately cause these trophic cascades, which you've seen a couple of examples of now, which do alter ecosystem structure and function as a whole. So it's important for us to carry on doing these kinds of studies, because if we understand the ecological role of these sharks, and we have a better chance of putting together effective and integrated conservation and management strategies to not only protect the predators, but also entire ecosystems. So, yeah, and that's just everybody that was involved in my master's research. So, just a thank you to all of those guys, and thank you to you guys for listening today.
Does anyone have any questions for either Lee or myself?
Just a question for me. Lee, you said that the cow sharks have a different way of catching seals than the great whites. What is their
So there have been a number of theories as to how they could be doing it, but it hasn't really been witnessed. So from some of the preliminary data on the tracking stuff, it seems that they're hunting at night, which makes it very difficult to observe how they're doing it. But it hasn't actually been witnessed, and there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how they are catching seals, and especially in the numbers, because we can suggest that it's scavenging, but the amount of seal in their diet suggests that it's too much to just be related to scavenging. So it's been suggested that there's pack hunting, but it's difficult to say unless you've seen it. But maybe, like Meg said, maybe some mysteries are best left unsolved.
When you said that the great whites are at Seal Island at a certain time of year, I think you said summer.
Winter, yeah.
And that the cow sharks aren't there then, but then the cow sharks move in at a different time of year. Are they just avoiding the great whites?
I think so. As much as this information shows that cow shark to be in a higher trophic level relative to the great white, I think if they had to have a one-on-one showdown, I think it would go one way. I think the white shark would have the upper hand there. But it's been very interesting, and I think Alison would also tell you that the dynamics in False Bay between predators at the moment. Trends we've seen in previous years, there seems to be a bit of a reshuffle now. I mean, cow sharks have been seen now at Seal Island quite consistently during the summer months, where the white sharks generally aren't there. So it could be that they're taking advantage of that abundant prey source without the competition or even possibly threat from the white shark. But that needs to be looked at with that tracking data, which is so important before you can make any kind of real assumption or as to what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, the cow sharks, if you want to go and observe them, you get to this point, it used to be. Why would they choose a location like that at a distance from seal food supply?
So it's always been an interesting question for us. Why were they using Miller's Point? And one of the ideas could be relating to feeding, because there's a lot of these chondrichthyan species around there. But one of the theories was that it was also used as a refuge site, possibly from the great white. But you may have heard of the incidences with the killer whales or the orcas, and so refuge site clearly wasn't working too well. So now they don't seem to be hanging around anymore. There's actually a really good paper you could read. A really good friend of mine and colleague just wrote a paper on that interaction between the killer whales and the seven-gill sharks. A lot of us know about the interactions with the white sharks, I'm sure, but it actually, before we heard about it with the white sharks, the same thing happened with the seven-gill sharks. And there's a good paper online. I think you can maybe get the name if people would. Oh, is she? Okay, so I think there'll be some more talk on killer whales and sharks coming up, so I won't spoil too much of that. But yeah, Miller's Point was a real hot spot for them, but now they seem to be interesting, very interesting.
Best place to go to avoid great whites.
But not killer whales, apparently. Yes.
Are we going to discuss or going to be presented about cage diving? Is that going to be discussed with you?
This would be a good place
Well,
to
that's what
talk
I'm
about.
going to ask about that.
Sure.
Is it a bad thing?
Look, I think it's a very complicated discussion, and my personal view is that here in South Africa we have a very highly regulated cage diving industry, and we're not allowed to provision the white sharks when they come to the cage, which means feed them. So they're not ostensibly not getting a food reward and learning to associate humans with food necessarily, but that's complicated. But so we have a very highly regulated industry. The industry members in the cage diving industry actually regulate each other with code of conduct issues because it is so competitive and it is so high value that they want to make sure that they're the best in getting the most clients. And the educational spin-offs of cage diving are really valuable. So I've seen sharkaders, like avid sharkaders, go on a cage diving experience and come back shark advocates. And I don't think that the trade-off between educational benefits that's done under responsible conditions and can really be, knocked for being a bad industry. That being said, of course, it is the nature of people to try and do some bad things in industries sometimes, and you will occasionally see some of the cage diving operators contravening permit conditions and things like that are designed to protect the sharks as well as people. So those are often, as I say, quickly reported to the relevant authorities. So, there's been a lot of people's questions have to do with the conditioning of the animals and whether we're teaching them to associate people with food. We're not feeding the sharks. Well, the industry is not feeding the sharks normally, but there are studies underway, as far as I know. Alison Tanner's PhD is examining what the sort of physiological responses of the sharks would be to searching for food all the time and not getting a reward, as well as on how they're interacting with the cages and the divers themselves. So that body of knowledge, I think, hasn't been published yet. I don't know, do you have anything to add to that? So the chum that is used in the cage diving operations historically was a combination of fish oil and fish parts as well as shark liver, because shark liver makes white sharks go into this crazy stupor kind of thing, and they react to it really well. It's like a shark orgasm. Sorry, I'm just putting that out there. That's really weird. No, but they respond to it, and it creates this really fantastic, animalistic drive. And then, of course, the Department of Environmental Affairs thought it was unethical to be using shark product to attract sharks in the ecotourism industry. So that was disallowed. And now what's used is anchovy oil and seawater and fish heads. So in theory, they're not doing anything different to what fishermen in the coastal environment are doing, have been doing for hundreds of years.
Of whales bleaching and this sort of thing, because if there's some kind of underlying disease process. Now, working in the aquarium, do you not have problems as, I'm from a poultry background, you put a lot of chickens together and you sort of get disease problems. Do you get disease problems in the aquarium?
Nothing that extreme that would come from I don't know, something like that. We have a very, very good quarantine procedure. So every animal that we get in